baby found a bear cub stuck in a hospital elevator. What he did next amazed doctors. The hospital corridors stretched endlessly in the dim light of evening, their polished floors reflecting the soft glow from overhead fixtures that had been turned down for the night shift. Lily Morgan walked slowly, her footsteps barely making a sound against the tiles, as she carried her 6-month-old son, Connor, close to her chest. The baby had been fussy all day, refusing to settle despite her best efforts, and the pediatric ward nurses had suggested a walk might help calm him down. She pressed the elevator button with her free hand, shifting Connor's weight slightly as he whimpered softly against her shoulder. The familiar ding of the arriving elevator echoed through the empty hallway, and she stepped inside without looking up, her attention focused entirely on soothing her restless child. The doors slid closed with their usual mechanical whisper, and she pressed the button for the ground floor, hoping the gentle motion might finally lull Connor to sleep. The elevator began its descent smoothly, the numbers above the door counting down from 7, 6, 5, and then suddenly, without warning, everything stopped. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied to a dimmer glow than before. Lily felt her heart skip a beat as she realized they were stuck between floors, the digital display frozen between the 3rd and 4th levels. She reached for the emergency button, but before her finger could make contact, she heard something that made her freeze completely. It was a sound so unexpected, so impossible in this sterile hospital environment, that for a moment she thought she must be imagining it. A soft, plaintive whimper came from the corner of the elevator, different from Connor's baby sounds, more like the cry of a small animal in distress. She turned slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer lighting. And what she saw made her gasp involuntarily. There, huddled in the far corner of the elevator, was a small bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, its dark fur matted and its eyes wide with what looked like fear. The cub couldn't have been more than a few months old, its paws still oversized for its body, in that way young animals often are. Its breathing was rapid and shallow, and Lily could see it trembling slightly as it pressed itself against the elevator wall. Her first instinct was to back away, to protect Connor from what her rational mind told her was a wild animal, dangerous and unpredictable. But something in the cub's eyes stopped her. They weren't the eyes of a predator or even a frightened animal ready to attack. They held something else entirely, something that seemed almost human in its vulnerability. Connor, who had been whimpering moments before, suddenly went quiet in her arms. His small head turned toward the cub, and to Lily's amazement he reached out one chubby hand in the direction of the frightened animal. The cub's trembling slowed, and it lifted its head slightly, dark eyes meeting Connor's innocent gaze. What happened next would stay with Lily for the rest of her life, a moment so pure and unexpected that it seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. Connor made a soft cooing sound, the kind he usually reserved for his favorite stuffed animals, and the bear cub responded with a gentle huffing noise that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. The two babies, one human and one bear, seemed to recognize something in each other that transcended species, age, or logic. The cub took a tentative step forward, then another, moving with the awkward grace of youth toward where Lily stood frozen with Connor in her arms. She wanted to step back, every maternal instinct screaming at her to protect her child, but something held her in place. Perhaps it was the absolute calm that had come over Connor, or maybe it was the way the cub moved, not with aggression, but with what could only be described as hope. The elevator's emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere as the cub came closer. When it was just a few feet away, it sat down carefully, as if understanding that sudden movements might frighten them. Connor giggled, a sound of pure delight that echoed in the small space, and the cub's ears perked up at the sound. Lily found herself slowly lowering herself to sit on the elevator floor, her legs suddenly feeling too weak to support her. She kept Connor close but allowed him to lean forward slightly toward the cub. The baby's hand stretched out again, fingers splayed wide in that universal gesture of young children wanting to touch something new and interesting. The cub leaned forward too, and for one heart-stopping moment, baby finger met soft fur. The touch lasted only a second, but in that brief contact, something extraordinary happened. The cub made a sound Lily had never heard before, somewhere between a purr and a hum, and Connor laughed again, this time louder and more joyfully than she'd heard in days. The elevator suddenly felt less like a trapped space and more like a sanctuary, a place where the impossible had become possible. She noticed then that around the cub's neck was something unusual. A small leather cord with what looked like a carved wooden token hanging from it. The token was old, worn smooth by time and touch, with symbols carved into it that she couldn't recognize. It seemed out of place on a wild animal, suggesting a story she couldn't even begin to imagine. Meanwhile, 3 floors up in the hospital's security office, Michael Hayes was just settling in for what he expected to be another quiet night shift when multiple alarms began flashing on his monitors. The elevator between floors 3 and 4 had stopped, and according to the system it contained 2 passengers, though the weight sensors were showing unusual readings. He pulled up the camera feed from inside the elevator and nearly dropped his coffee mug at what he saw. There was Lily Morgan, one of the regular visitors to the pediatric ward, sitting on the floor with her baby, and across from them was what appeared to be a bear cub. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. But the image remained the same. His hand hovered over the emergency call button that would alert the entire security team and probably cause a panic, but something made him hesitate. The scene on his monitor didn't look dangerous. If anything, it looked peaceful, almost magical in its strangeness. Michael zoomed in with the camera, trying to get a better view of what was happening. The bear cub was now lying down, its head resting on its paws, watching as Connor played with his mother's hair. The baby would occasionally look over at the cub and wave his arms excitedly, and each time he did, the cub's ears would twitch in what looked like acknowledgement. Michael had worked hospital security for 15 years, had seen all manner of strange things happen within these walls, but nothing quite like this. He picked up his phone and called Dr. Ethan Marshall, the head of pediatrics who he knew was still in the building. If anyone would know how to handle this situation without causing unnecessary alarm, it would be him. Dr. Marshall answered on the 3rd ring, his voice tired but alert in the way of doctors who were used to being called at odd hours. Michael explained what he was seeing, half expecting the doctor to think he was playing some kind of prank. But Dr. Marshall's response surprised him. Instead of disbelief or alarm, there was a long pause followed by a quiet request to see the footage himself. Michael sent the feed to the doctor's phone, and he heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Dr. Marshall said he would be right there and asked Michael not to alert anyone else just yet. There was something in his voice, a mixture of wonder and recognition, that made Michael even more curious about what was unfolding in that elevator. Back in the elevator, Lily had lost all sense of time. It could have been minutes or hours since they'd been stuck. The outside world had ceased to matter. Connor had never been calmer, occasionally reaching toward the cub, who would respond by shifting slightly closer, always careful, always gentle. She found herself talking softly, not really to anyone in particular, just filling the silence with her voice. She told the cub about Connor, about how he'd been born 2 months early and had spent his first weeks of life in this very hospital. She talked about the sleepless nights, the worry, The joy when he'd finally been strong enough to come home. The cub listened, or at least appeared to, its dark eyes never leaving them, and Lily could have sworn she saw understanding there. The wooden token around the cub's neck caught the light again, and Lily found herself drawn to examine it more closely. Without thinking, she reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement so as not to startle the animal. The cub didn't flinch as her fingers touched the token, turning it gently to see the carved symbols better. They were intricate, clearly made with care and skill, depicting what looked like trees, stars, and something that might have been a figure holding a child. The wood was old, older than anything that should be hanging around a young cub's neck, and it was warm to the touch in a way that had nothing to do with body heat. As she examined it, Connor reached out again, his tiny fingers brushing against the cub's fur near the token, and the cub made that strange purring sound again. It was then that Lily noticed something else extraordinary. Where Connor's hand touched the cub's fur, there seemed to be a faint glow. So subtle, she thought at first it must be a trick of the emergency lighting. But as she watched, she saw it again, a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from the point of a contact between baby and bear. It wasn't frightening or unnatural. Instead, it felt right somehow, as if this meeting had been meant to happen. The cub shifted, moving even closer until it was curled up next to where Lily sat, its body forming a protective curve near Connor. The baby laughed again, a sound of pure happiness, and reached out to pat the cub's head with clumsy but affectionate movements. Dr. Marshall arrived at the security office slightly out of breath, having taken the stairs rather than wait for another elevator. Michael showed him the live feed, and the doctor stood transfixed, watching the scene unfold. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call to someone, speaking in hushed tones that Michael couldn't quite make out. When he hung up, he turned to Michael with an expression that was difficult to read. He asked if there was any footage of how the cub had gotten into the elevator in the first place. Michael had already been checking, scrolling back through the recordings, but there was nothing. One moment, the elevator was empty. The next, when Lily entered, the cub was already there, as if it had materialized out of thin air. The timestamps showed no gaps, no editing, just an impossibility captured on digital video. Dr. Marshall asked Michael to keep monitoring the situation, but not to intervene unless absolutely necessary. He said he needed to check something in his office and would be back shortly. As he left, Michael noticed the doctor's hands were trembling slightly, not with fear, but with what looked like excitement or perhaps recognition. Left alone with the monitors, Michael continued to watch, mesmerized by what was happening in the elevator. The cub had now placed one paw gently on Connor's leg, and the baby had stopped moving, his eyes growing heavy with sleep. Lily was singing softly, a lullaby Michael recognized from his own childhood, and the cub's eyes were slowly closing too, as if the song was meant for both babies. The security office phone rang, startling Michael from his observation. It was Jessica Brooks from the night nursing staff, calling to report that several patients on the pediatric ward had suddenly become calm. Children who had been restless or in pain were now sleeping peacefully, and the monitors showed their vital signs had all stabilized to optimal levels. She wanted to know if something was happening, if there had been any changes to the ventilation system or medications. Michael told her he would look into it, but his eyes never left the elevator feed. Somehow, he knew the two things were connected, that whatever was happening in that small space was radiating outward, touching lives throughout the hospital. Dr. Marshall returned carrying an old leather-bound book that looked completely out of place in the modern hospital setting. He opened it carefully, the pages yellowed with age, and showed Michael a drawing that made them both catch their breath. It was the same symbol that was carved on the wooden token around the cub's neck. The doctor explained that his grandmother had given him this book years ago, filled with what he'd always thought were just old folk tales from the mountains. Stories about guardian spirits that took the form of animals, appearing in times of great need to protect the innocent. He'd never believed them, had kept the book as a sentimental reminder of his grandmother's storytelling, but now, watching the screen, he wondered if perhaps there had been truth in those old stories after all. In the elevator, Connor had fallen asleep, his small hand still resting on the cub's fur. Lily felt a peace she hadn't experienced in months, maybe years. The constant worry that had been her companion since Connor's difficult birth seemed to have lifted, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. The cub was awake, but perfectly still, as if understanding that any movement might wake the sleeping baby. Its breathing had synchronized with Connor's, and Lily realized with a start that her own breathing had fallen into the same rhythm. They were connected, the three of them, in a way that defied explanation but felt absolutely natural. She thought about all the nights she'd spent in this hospital when Connor was in the NICU, the prayers she'd whispered to anyone or anything that might be listening, begging for her baby to be okay. She thought about the doctors who'd told her to prepare for the worst, about the tiny incubator that had been Connor's whole world for those first crucial weeks. And now, here they were, her miracle baby and this impossible bear cub, sharing a moment that felt like an answer to all those desperate prayers. The token around the cub's neck seemed to pulse gently with that strange warm light, and Lily found herself wondering who had put it there. What story lay behind this young animal's presence in their elevator? Time continued to pass in its strange, suspended way. Michael watched from the security office as other staff members occasionally passed by the stuck elevator, none of them aware of the miracle happening inside. Dr. Marshall had been making phone calls speaking to maintenance about the elevator while carefully not mentioning its unusual occupants. He wanted to get them out, of course, but he also understood that this moment, whatever it was, needed to unfold in its own time. He'd seen enough in his years of medicine to know that sometimes the unexplainable was just as important as the scientific, that healing came in forms that couldn't be measured or documented in medical journals. The book he'd brought contained more than just the symbol. There were stories, written in his grandmother's careful hand, about times when the boundary between the human world and something older, wilder, became thin. Always, these moments centered around children, around innocence that called to something protective in the natural world. The stories spoke of bears particularly, how they were considered sacred protectors in many cultures, bridges between the earthly and the spiritual. Dr. Marshall had always dismissed these tales as beautiful, but ultimately just stories. Now, watching a bear cub comfort a human baby in a hospital elevator, he wondered what other truths might be hidden in his grandmother's words. Lily noticed that the air in the elevator had changed. Despite being stuck in a small space for what must have been over an hour now, it didn't feel stuffy or close. Instead, there was a freshness to it, like the air after a spring rain or the breath of wind from a forest. The cub's fur, which she could now see more clearly, wasn't matted as she'd first thought, but was actually quite beautiful, with subtle variations in color that caught the emergency lighting. Around its eyes were markings that almost looked like tears, and she remembered reading somewhere that all bears had these markings, though no one knew why. Looking at this cub, she thought perhaps they were tears of joy, or maybe tears for all the connections between humans and nature that had been lost over time. Connor stirred in his sleep, making small sounds that usually preceded waking. The cub's ear twitched, and it made a soft rumbling sound, almost like a cat's purr, but deeper, more resonant. Immediately, Connor settled back into peaceful sleep, his tiny fingers curling into the cub's fur. Lily felt tears sliding down her cheeks, though she couldn't have said exactly why she was crying. It wasn't sadness or fear, but something more complex. A mixture of gratitude, wonder, and a kind of grief for a world where moments like this were so rare. She thought about all the children in the hospital, fighting battles no child should have to fight, and wondered if this cub's presence was somehow for all of them, a reminder that magic and healing could come from the most unexpected places. Dr. Marshall had been reading more from his grandmother's book, finding passages that seemed to speak directly to what they were witnessing. One story told of a time when a great sickness had come to a village, affecting mainly the children. The village healers had tried everything they knew, but nothing worked until one night. A bear walked into the village, right into the healing house where the sickest children lay. Instead of attacking or causing panic, the bear had simply laid down among the children, and by morning the fever had broken in every single one. The bear had disappeared with the dawn, leaving only a wooden token to prove it had really been there. Dr. Marshall looked at the screen, at the token hanging from the cub's neck, and felt a chill run down his spine. Michael had been monitoring the hospital's systems and noticed something remarkable. Since the elevator had stopped, not a single emergency alarm had gone off in the pediatric ward. For a hospital that typically saw constant activity, especially at night when children's fears and pains seemed magnified, this was unprecedented. He pulled up the ward's statistics and saw that vital signs across the board were stable. Pain medication requests had dropped to 0. And the night nurses were reporting that children who hadn't slept properly in days were now in deep, restful sleep. Whatever was happening in that elevator was affecting the entire children's wing of the hospital, creating a bubble of peace that defied medical explanation. In the elevator, the cub had shifted slightly, and Lily saw something she hadn't noticed before. Along its back leg was a scar, old but significant. The kind that suggested this young animal had already faced hardship in its short life. Yet, here it was, offering comfort to a human baby, showing no fear or aggression, despite what must have been traumatic experiences with her species. She thought about all the walls humans built, between themselves and nature, between each other, between their hearts and the possibility of magic. This cub had somehow crossed all those walls to be here, in this moment, with her and Connor. The impossibility of it should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with a hope she hadn't felt in a very long time. The token around the cub's neck turned slightly, and in the shifting light, Lily saw there were more symbols on the back. These looked different, newer perhaps, and as she leaned closer to see, she gasped. Carved in small but clear letters was a name, Connor, her son's name, on a token that looked older than the hospital itself, worn by a bear cub that couldn't possibly know them. Her rational mind tried to find explanations, coincidences, other Connors who might have existed, but her heart knew better. This was meant for them, specifically for her baby, a gift or a message from something beyond her understanding. She pulled Connor closer, feeling the warmth of his small body and the surprising warmth emanating from the cub beside them. Dr. Marshall had made a decision. He asked Michael to slowly begin evacuating the floors around the stuck elevator, using a routine maintenance excuse. He didn't want a crowd when they finally got the doors open, didn't want this moment turned into a spectacle, or, worse, a panic. He'd seen enough to know that whatever was happening needed to conclude naturally, without interference from well-meaning but potentially disruptive outside forces. He thought about calling animal control, as protocol demanded, but something in him rebelled against the idea. This cub wasn't a threat or even really a wild animal in the traditional sense. It was something else, something that belonged here right now, even if it didn't belong here typically. The evacuation was subtle and smooth, the night staff responding to Dr. Marshall's requests without question. He was respected in the hospital, known for his dedication to his young patients and his ability to remain calm in any crisis. If he said they needed to clear the area for maintenance, they cleared the area. Soon, the hallways around the stuck elevator were empty except for Dr. Marshall himself, who stood by the doors listening. He could hear Lily's voice, soft and melodic, still singing lullabies. He could hear Connor's occasional baby sounds and, remarkably, what sounded like the cub responding with its own gentle noises. It was a conversation without words, a communion between species that touched something deep in his chest. Inside the elevator, something was changing. The cub was getting restless, not in an aggressive way, but like it knew its time was coming to an end. It stood slowly, careful not to disturb Connor, who was now awake but calm, watching the cub with those wide, innocent eyes that babies have. The cub moved toward the elevator doors, placing one paw against the metal as if sensing something beyond. Then it turned back to Connor and did something that made Lily's breath catch. It lowered its head in what could only be described as a boo, a gesture of respect or farewell that seemed impossibly human. Connor laughed and reached out his arms, and the cub came back for one more moment of contact. This time, when the baby's hand touched the cub's fur, the glow was brighter, visible even in the emergency lighting. It spread from the point of contact, encompassing both baby and bear in a soft golden light that filled the elevator. Lily felt warmth wash over her, not just physical but emotional, spiritual even. Every worry, every fear she'd carried since Connor's birth seemed to lift, replaced by an absolute certainty that her son would be okay, that he was protected by something greater than she could understand. The cub made that purring sound one more time, longer and deeper than before. And Connor responded with a sound Lily had never heard him make, almost like he was trying to purr back. The elevator suddenly shuddered, and the normal lights flickered back on. The mechanical sounds of the building returned, and Lily could hear the familiar ding that meant the elevator was about to move. The cub backed away toward the corner where she'd first seen it, but its eyes never left Connor. As the elevator began to rise, completing its interrupted journey to the 4th floor, the cub seemed to shimmer, its outline becoming less distinct. Lily blinked, trying to focus, but it was like looking at something through water. The last thing she saw clearly was the wooden token, which had somehow come loose from the leather cord and was lying on the elevator floor. The doors opened on the 4th floor, and Dr. Marshall was there, his face a mixture of concern and wonder. He helped Lily to her feet, Connor still in her arms, and his eyes immediately went to the corner where the cub had been. There was nothing there, no sign that a wild animal had ever been in the space except for the wooden token on the floor. Lily pointed to it, unable to form words to explain what had happened. Dr. Marshall picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hands, seeing Connor's name carved there just as Lily had. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes that he believed her, that he'd seen enough on the security footage to know something extraordinary had occurred. They moved out of the elevator into the hallway, and Lily was surprised to find it empty. Usually, the 4th floor was busy even at night, but it was peaceful, quiet in a way that felt intentional. Dr. Marshall led them to a nearby family room, gesturing for her to sit while he examined Connor. The baby was perfect, more than perfect actually. His color was better than it had been in weeks, his breathing deeper and more regular. All the little concerns that had brought Lily to the hospital repeatedly since his birth seemed to have vanished. Dr. Marshall checked him thoroughly but could find nothing wrong, nothing that needed treatment or attention. Connor was simply, miraculously, healthy. As Dr. Marshall completed his examination, he told Lily about the security footage, about how he and Michael had watched the entire encounter. He told her about his grandmother's book and the stories of guardian spirits. He showed her the passages about bears as protectors, about the thin places where different worlds touched. Lily listened, holding Connor close, the wooden token now hanging from a new cord around her baby's neck. It felt right there, like it had always belonged to him. She told Dr. Marshall about the moment of connection, about the glow she'd seen, about the absolute peace she'd felt. He nodded, not with the patronizing agreement of someone humoring a distressed mother, but with genuine understanding. Michael arrived then, having locked down the security office after making copies of all the footage. He'd also brought something else, reports from the pediatric ward about what had happened during the time the elevator was stuck. Every single child in the ward had shown improvement. Pain scores had dropped. Fevers had broken. And several children with chronic conditions had experienced temporary but significant relief. The medical staff was calling it a statistical anomaly, unable to explain the simultaneous improvement in so many patients. But Michael, Dr. Marshall, and Lily knew better. They knew it was connected to the cub, to that moment of pure connection between wild and innocent. Dr. Marshall made a decision then that would affect how this story was remembered. He suggested they keep the truth between themselves, at least the whole truth. The official report would mention the elevator malfunction, Lily and Connor being stuck, and perhaps a mention of some kind of animal that had somehow gotten into the elevator and then escaped. But the full story, the magic of what had really happened, would remain with those who had witnessed it. Not because the world didn't deserve to know, but because some things were too precious, too pure to be subjected to scrutiny and skepticism. This was Connor's story, his miracle, and it deserved to be protected. Over the next few hours, as dawn approached, they pieced together what they could. The token was indeed old, older than any of them had first realized. Dr. Marshall had a friend at the university who specialized in indigenous artifacts, and without revealing where it had come from, he'd sent photos. The response was immediate and excited. The symbols were from a language that predated written records in the region, and the wood was from a tree species that had been extinct for over a century. Yet here it was, perfectly preserved, with Connor's name carved in modern English on one side. It was an impossibility wrapped in an enigma, a puzzle that had no solution except faith. Lily finally took Connor home as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded her of the glow she'd seen in the elevator. Connor slept peacefully in his car seat, the wooden token visible beneath his tiny shirt. As she drove, she thought about the cub, wondering where it had gone, if it had returned to whatever forest or dimension it had come from. She thought about the scar on its leg and hoped that its encounter with Connor had healed something in the cub, just as it had healed something in her son. The rational part of her mind kept trying to find explanations. But her heart had already accepted the truth that some things didn't need explaining, they just needed to be accepted with gratitude. In the days that followed, Connor continued to thrive in ways that amazed his doctors. The health issues that had plagued him since his premature birth simply vanished. He slept through the night, ate without difficulty, and met every developmental milestone early. The pediatricians had no explanation, running test after test, all of which came back perfect. Lily kept the token hidden during these visits, sensing that it was not something to be shared with those who would try to rationalize it away. At night, when Connor slept, she would sometimes see a soft glow emanating from where the token rested against his chest, a gentle reminder that their guardian was still watching. Dr. Marshall continued his research into his grandmother's stories, finding more connections between the old tales and what they had witnessed. He discovered that throughout history there had been similar accounts, always involving children in distress, always featuring animals that behaved in impossibly intelligent and compassionate ways. The stories came from different cultures, different continents, but the core was always the same. In moments of great need, when innocence called out to the universe, sometimes the universe answered in forms that defied human understanding. He started a private journal, documenting what had happened with Connor and the cub, adding it to the collection of mysteries that made him remember why he'd become a doctor in the first place. Michael, for his part, kept the security footage on a private drive, encrypted and hidden. He'd shown it to his wife, who'd cried at the beauty of what she saw, and to his daughter, who'd immediately asked if the bear cub could come to their house. He'd tried to explain that it wasn't that kind of bear, that it was something special, something that couldn't be owned or kept. His daughter had nodded solemnly and said she understood that some friends could only visit once, but that once was enough if you remembered them. Out of the mouths of babes, Michael had thought, came the greatest wisdom. He found himself checking the elevator cameras more frequently, always hoping to catch another glimpse of magic. The hospital itself seemed different after that night. The pediatric ward reported a significant decrease in complications and an increase in what the staff started calling spontaneous improvements. Children who'd been scheduled for serious procedures found their conditions improving without intervention. Parents reported that their children were having dreams about a friendly bear who told them they would be okay. The medical staff couldn't explain it, but they couldn't deny it either. Some of the nurses, those who'd been there longest, would occasionally mention feeling a presence in the ward, something protective and warm that seemed to watch over the sickest children. Lily brought Connor back to the hospital for his regular checkups, and each time she felt a pull toward that elevator. Sometimes she would take it, riding up and down, remembering. Once, she could have sworn she smelled pine forest and wild honey, scents that had no place in a sterile hospital environment. Connor would always become excited in the elevator, looking around as if expecting to see his friend again. The token would grow warm against his chest, and Lily would know that somehow the connection remained. The cub might be gone, but what it had brought to them, the healing and the hope, that remained. As Connor grew, reaching his first birthday and then his second, the token grew with him. The leather cord somehow always the perfect length. He never tried to remove it, never seemed bothered by it, treating it as a natural part of himself. When he started to talk, one of his first words was bear, though Lily had never told him the story, thinking him too young to understand. But Connor seemed to know, seemed to remember, even though logic said he'd been too young to form memories from that night. He would sometimes stop playing and touch the token, smiling as if greeting an old friend, and Lily would feel that same peace wash over her that she'd felt in the elevator. Dr. Marshall eventually shared the story with a small group of colleagues he trusted, doctors who'd seen enough to know that medicine didn't have all the answers. They formed an informal group, meeting monthly to discuss cases that defied explanation, moments when healing came from sources beyond their understanding. The story of Connor and the cub became legend among them, a reminder that their role as healers sometimes meant simply creating space for miracles to occur. They never published papers or sought recognition, understanding that some knowledge was meant to be held quietly, shared only with those who could receive it with the right kind of faith. The token itself remained a mystery. Every expert who examined it, and there were only a few trusted souls allowed that privilege, confirmed its impossibility. The wood shouldn't exist. The carvings were from a lost culture, and Connor's name shouldn't be there at all. Yet there it was, defying explanation, a tangible reminder that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than most people imagined. Sometimes, late at night, Lily would hold it while Connor slept, feeling its warmth, and she would whisper a thank you to whatever force had sent the cub to them. She never expected an answer, but sometimes the token would pulse gently, like a heartbeat, letting her know her gratitude had been received. Years passed, and Connor grew into a remarkable child, healthy and strong in ways that continued to amaze everyone who knew his early history. He had an unusual affinity for animals, able to calm the most frightened pets at the veterinary clinic where Lily eventually took a job. Dogs that bit everyone else would let Connor pet them. Cats that hid from strangers would curl up in his lap. The veterinarian joked that Connor had a gift, not knowing how literally true that was. The token remained hidden under his shirt, a secret between mother and son, though Connor seemed to understand instinctively that it was not something to be shown to everyone. One day, when Connor was 5, they were hiking in the mountains outside the city, a rare adventure for them. They'd stopped to rest by a stream when Connor suddenly stood up, his hand going to the token. He looked into the trees with an expression of recognition, and Lily followed his gaze. There, barely visible in the shadows between the pines, was a full-grown bear. Lily's heart stopped, her mind racing through what to do, how to protect Connor, but the boy showed no fear. He raised his hand in a small wave, and the bear, impossibly, seemed to nod before turning and disappearing into the forest. Connor looked up at his mother and said simply, "That was my friend's mama. She wanted to say thank you." Lily never knew if Connor was right, if the bear they'd seen was connected to the cub from the elevator. But she chose to believe it, chose to accept that the world was full of connections that couldn't be mapped or measured. She thought about all the families in that hospital, all the children fighting battles that seemed impossible, and she hoped that each of them would have their own moment of magic, their own visit from something beyond understanding that would remind them that they were not alone, that the universe itself was invested in their healing and their hope. The story of the elevator became a legend in the hospital, told in whispers by the night staff. Details changed with each telling, as stories do, but the core remained. Sometimes, in our darkest moments, help comes from the most unexpected places. New parents with sick children would occasionally ask about it, having heard fragments from other families, and the nurses would smile and say that miracles happened every day in their hospital, you just had to be watching for them. And sometimes, just sometimes, a child would report seeing a friendly bear in their dreams, telling them they would be okay, and the parents would exchange glances, wondering if the legend might be true. Dr. Marshall retired eventually, but not before establishing a special fund at the hospital for families who couldn't afford treatment. He called it the Guardian Fund, and its logo was a simple wooden token with a tree carved on it. He never explained the name or the logo to anyone except Lily, who understood perfectly. The fund helped hundreds of families over the years, another form of magic spreading from that single night in the elevator. Connor would sometimes visit the hospital with his mother, and Dr. Marshall would always make time to see them, to check that the token was still there, still warm, still working its quiet magic. Suo's chapters of Part 1 completed. The morning after Connor's 6th birthday, something extraordinary happened that would connect their story to a larger tapestry of mysteries. Lily woke to find Connor standing by his bedroom window, the token glowing visibly in the pre-dawn darkness. He was completely calm, almost entranced, watching something outside that Lily couldn't see from her angle. When she joined him at the window, her breath caught in her throat. There, in their small backyard, were 3 cubs, sitting in a perfect triangle formation, their heads tilted up toward Connor's window. They stayed for exactly 3 minutes, long enough for Lily to grab her phone and capture a single, blurry photo before they turned in unison and walked away, disappearing into the urban landscape as if they'd never been there at all. That same morning, hundreds of miles away in different hospitals across the country, similar reports began to surface. children with chronic illnesses were experiencing sudden improvements, and several reported dreams or visions of friendly bears. Dr. Marshall, though retired, still maintained connections with his medical network, and when these reports reached him, he felt a chill of recognition. He called Lily immediately, and when she told him about the 3 cubs, he knew that whatever had started in their elevator was part of something much bigger. He began reaching out to his contacts, carefully investigating each case, looking for patterns that might explain what was happening. What he found defied medical explanation, but had a strange internal logic of its own. Each child who experienced these improvements had been born prematurely, had fought for life in their first weeks just as Connor had. Each family reported some kind of animal encounter. Not always bears, but always something unusual, something that shouldn't have been where it was. And in 3 cases, children had been given or had found wooden tokens similar to Connor's, though none with their names already carved. It was as if the universe had identified these fighters, these small warriors who'd entered the world against the odds, and had marked them for protection. Connor himself seemed to understand something about his role in this expanding mystery. He became quieter, more thoughtful, often spending long periods just holding the token and staring into space. When Lily asked him what he was thinking about, he would say he was listening to his friend, that the bear cub was teaching him things. She wanted to dismiss this as childhood imagination, but the things Connor knew, the insights he had about other children's illnesses when they encountered them, were too specific, too accurate to be mere fantasy. He would sometimes approach a crying child in a store or park, whisper something to them, and they would immediately calm, their parents amazed at the transformation. The token itself was changing too. The wood, which had remained constant for years, was developing new patterns in its grain, swirls and whirls that hadn't been there before. When Lily mentioned this to Dr. Marshall, he brought over his grandmother's book again, finding a passage she hadn't seen before. It spoke of living totems, objects that grew and evolved with their bearers, becoming more powerful as the connection deepened. The passage suggested that these totems were not just protective charms, but bridges, allowing communication between the human world and something older, wilder, more fundamental to the nature of existence itself. One evening, as autumn painted the leaves in shades of fire, Connor asked his mother to take him back to the hospital, specifically to the elevator where it had all begun. Lily hesitated, not sure if revisiting that space would be healing or harmful, but something in Connor's eyes, a wisdom beyond his years, convinced her. They arrived at the hospital just as visiting hours were ending, the hallways quieting as the day shift gave way to night. The elevator was just an elevator now, no different from any other in the building, but Connor approached it with reverence, placing his small hand on the doors before they opened. Inside, he sat in the exact spot where the cub had been, closing his eyes and holding the token tightly. Lily watched, not sure what he was doing, but trusting in whatever process was happening. After several minutes, Connor opened his eyes and smiled, a smile so pure and joyful that it brought tears to Lily's eyes. He stood up and hugged his mother, whispering that his friend was happy, that lots of cubs were helping lots of children now, that what had started with them was spreading like ripples on a pond. He said the cub wanted her to know that she'd been chosen not randomly, but because her love for Connor had called out across dimensions, reaching something that could help. That night, Connor had a dream that he described to Lily in vivid detail the next morning. He was in a forest, but not an ordinary forest. The trees were ancient, their trunks wider than houses, their branches creating a canopy so thick that the light filtering through was green and gold. There were bears there, dozens of them, all sizes and ages, and they were having what Connor called a council. They were discussing the children, the sick ones, the frightened ones, the ones who needed help. Each bear was assigned to a child, given a token to deliver, a connection to establish. Connor said he understood that this had been happening for centuries, but recently something had changed. Some barrier had weakened, allowing more direct intervention. Dr. Marshall, when told of this dream, pulled out maps and charts he'd been working on, plotting the locations of all the reported encounters. They formed a pattern, not random at all, but following what he recognized as ley lines, theoretical lines of electromagnetic energy that crisscrossed the Earth. Every encounter had happened at an intersection of these lines, suggesting that there were specific places where the veil between worlds was thinner. The hospital where Connor had met the cub sat at one of the strongest intersections in the region, which might explain why the encounter there had been so powerful, so transformative. As word of these investigations spread through Dr. Marshall's network of trusted colleagues, more stories emerged. A child in Seattle who'd been given days to live had recovered after a wolf pup had somehow appeared in her hospital room. A boy in Maine with a rare genetic disorder had found an eagle feather that glowed like Connor's token, and his symptoms had been manageable ever since. Each story was unique, but followed the same pattern: an impossible animal encounter, a token or sign, and healing that medical science couldn't explain. The medical establishment as a whole remained skeptical, but those who'd witnessed these events firsthand knew something profound was happening. Connor started school, and his teachers immediately noticed something special about him. He had an uncanny ability to comfort upset children, to know when someone was sick before they showed symptoms, to bring calm to chaotic situations. The token remained hidden under his shirt, but its influence was evident in everything he did. Other children were drawn to him, not as a leader or popular kid, but as someone who made them feel safe. Parents would comment that their children's nightmares stopped after playing with Connor, that behavioral problems improved, that inexplicable fears simply vanished. One day, a new student arrived at Connor's school, a girl named Savannah Reed, who'd just moved to town with her family. She was withdrawn, clearly dealing with some trauma the teachers weren't fully aware of. Connor approached her at recess, and instead of speaking, he simply sat beside her in silence. After a few minutes, she looked at him with eyes full of unshed tears and whispered, "You've seen them too, haven't you? The animals that shouldn't be there." Connor nodded and showed her his token, just a glimpse, but enough for her to pull out her own from beneath her collar, a small piece of carved jade in the shape of a dolphin. Savannah's story, which she eventually shared with Connor and later with Lily, was both heartbreaking and miraculous. She'd been in a boating accident that had killed her father and left her in a coma for 3 weeks. During that time, she'd experienced what she called the water dreams, where dolphins had kept her company, teaching her how to breathe underwater, showing her that death wasn't an ending, but a transformation. When she'd woken up, she'd been clutching the jade dolphin, which no one could explain. Her mother had moved them away from the ocean, unable to bear the memories. But Savannah carried the sea with her in that small token. The friendship between Connor and Savannah became something beautiful to witness. They rarely spoke about their experiences directly, but they understood each other in a way that transcended words. Other children with similar experiences began to find them, drawn by some invisible force. There was Logan Carter, who'd survived a house fire and wore a phoenix feather that never burned. There was Haley Dawson, who'd been lost in the woods for 3 days and been guided home by a deer that left her with an acorn that never dried out. These children formed a quiet alliance, never speaking of it to adults except for Lily and Dr. Marshall, who'd become the unofficial guardians of their secret. Dr. Marshall, energized by these discoveries, began writing everything down, not for publication but for preservation. He felt strongly that this knowledge needed to be documented. even if the world wasn't ready for it yet. He interviewed each child carefully, with their parents' permission, recording their stories with the reverence they deserved. He noted patterns. The encounters always happened during moments of extreme crisis. The animals always showed intelligence beyond normal animal behavior, and the tokens always carried some form of energy that could be felt but not measured by conventional instruments. The tokens themselves seemed to be connected, forming a network of sorts. When the children were together, their tokens would sometimes glow in synchronization, creating patterns of light that reminded Dr. Marshall of constellation maps. He theorized that they were part of some ancient system, a way for the natural world to mark and protect certain humans who served a purpose not yet understood. Connor, being the first documented case in their group, seemed to be a focal point, his token often initiating the synchronized glowing, as if it was the conductor in an orchestra of light. One winter evening, when Connor was 8, something happened that would change their understanding of the phenomenon entirely. There was a severe storm, the kind that knocked out power and made travel dangerous. Connor woke his mother in the middle of the night, saying they needed to go to the hospital immediately. Despite the weather, despite the absurdity of the request, Lily bundled them up and drove through the blizzard, trusting her son's instincts. When they arrived, they found chaos. A bus carrying a youth hockey team had crashed, and the emergency room was overwhelmed with injured children. Connor walked through the emergency room with a calm that seemed impossible for a child his age. He moved from bed to bed, not touching anyone but simply standing near them, the token glowing so brightly it could be seen through his winter coat. Where he stood, children stopped crying. Their vital signs stabilized. Their pain visibly decreased. The medical staff was too busy to question what was happening, but those who noticed remembered. By morning, every child from that bus crash had survived and was recovering at a rate that had the doctors shaking their heads in amazement. The official reports credited the exceptional medical care, but those who'd been there knew something else had been at work. The storm that night had brought more than just snow and wind. In the morning, tracks were found around the hospital. Tracks that didn't match any animal native to the area. They circled the building 3 times, and where they passed, the snow had melted in perfect circles, leaving patches of green grass in the middle of winter. Security footage from outside cameras showed nothing but static during the hours the tracks were made, another impossibility in a night full of them. Connor, when asked about it, simply said his friends had come to help, that there had been too much pain for him to handle alone. This event marked a turning point. The children with tokens began to be more active, drawn to places where they were needed. Their parents, initially fearful, began to understand that their children had been given a gift and a responsibility. They formed a support network, helping each other navigate the challenges of raising children who were connected to something beyond ordinary understanding. They learned to recognize the signs when their children were being called, the restlessness, the distant look in their eyes, the way their tokens would grow warm without warning. Lily found herself at the center of this informal community, her home becoming a gathering place for families who needed to talk to someone who understood. She'd left her job at the veterinary clinic to focus on what she'd come to think of as her real work, helping these families understand and accept what was happening. She worked with Dr. Marshall to create resources, carefully worded to avoid triggering skepticism while providing real support. They called it the Guardian Network, and while it remained small and secret, its impact was profound. As Connor grew older, his abilities evolved. He could now sense illness or injury from a distance, knowing when someone in his school or neighborhood was suffering. The token had become so attuned to him that it seemed like an extension of his body, pulsing with his heartbeat, warming with his emotions. he learned to control the glow, to dim it when necessary to avoid attention, to brighten it when someone needed comfort. He never spoke of it as a burden, always as a gift, something that connected him to a purpose larger than himself. The other children were developing their own unique abilities, all related to their original encounters. Savannah could hold her breath for impossible lengths of time, and seemed to know when people were drowning, even metaphorically in their emotions. Logan was never cold, his body temperature always perfect regardless of the environment, and he could sense fires before they started. Haley had an uncanny ability to navigate, never getting lost, always knowing which direction to go when others were confused. Together, they were something more than the sum of their parts, a network of healing that operated below the radar of ordinary society. Dr. Marshall's research had led him to ancient texts from various cultures, all describing similar phenomena. The Aboriginal Australians had Dreamtime stories about animal spirits choosing human partners. Native American traditions spoke of spirit animals that provided protection and guidance. Celtic mythology was full of tales of children raised or saved by supernatural creatures. What if, he wondered, all these stories were describing the same thing from different cultural perspectives? What if there had always been this connection between the human and natural worlds, but modern society had simply forgotten how to see it? One spring afternoon, Connor asked his mother to take him camping. He'd never shown much interest in the outdoors beyond their occasional hikes, so this request surprised her. But she'd learned to trust his instincts, so she arranged a trip to a campground in the mountains, the same mountains where they'd seen the bear years before. As they set up their tent, Connor seemed to be waiting for something, constantly checking his token, looking into the forest with anticipation. As the sun set, he told his mother that tonight she would understand everything. As darkness fell and the campfire burned low, the forest around them began to come alive in ways that defied explanation. Animals emerged from the trees, not just one or two, but dozens. Bears, wolves, deer, owls, even small mice and rabbits, all gathering in a circle around their campsite. They showed no fear, no aggression, just a patient watchfulness. Connor stood up, his token glowing brighter than Lily had ever seen it, and walked to the edge of the circle. He placed his hand on the head of a large bear, and in that moment, Lily saw everything. She saw the network of connections spanning the globe, threads of light connecting children to animals, animals to the earth to something greater. She saw the purpose of it all, how these chosen children were meant to be bridges, helping humanity remember its connection to the natural world before it was too late. She saw the future, not fixed, but fluid, where the choices made now would determine whether humanity continued on its path of separation or found its way back to harmony. She saw Connor's role in this, not as a leader, but as a catalyst, someone whose story would inspire others to believe in the possibility of magic again. The vision lasted only seconds, but it changed everything for Lily. When it ended, the animals began to disperse, melting back into the forest as quietly as they'd come. Connor returned to the fire, looking tired but peaceful. He curled up against his mother and she held him close, understanding now the weight he'd been carrying, the knowledge he'd been holding. He was still her little boy, but he was also something more, a guardian of a secret that the world wasn't quite ready to know but desperately needed to believe in. They returned from the camping trip different, both of them carrying the knowledge of what they'd witnessed. Lily found herself able to sense things she couldn't before. Not as strongly as Connor, but enough to know when someone needed help, when a situation required their intervention. She wondered if prolonged exposure to the token, to Connor's gift, had awakened something in her too. Dr. Marshall, when told of the experience, wasn't surprised. He'd been documenting similar awakenings in other parents, a secondary effect of the phenomenon that suggested it was meant to spread, to grow, to eventually encompass more than just the chosen children. Connor's teenage years brought new challenges. The hormonal changes of adolescence affected his connection to the token, sometimes amplifying it to uncomfortable levels, sometimes dampening it until he felt lost. There were days when he could hear the thoughts of every animal within a mile radius, a cacophony that left him with crushing headaches. Other days, the silence was so complete, he worried the gift had abandoned him. Through it all, the token remained warm against his chest, a constant reminder that he was never truly alone. The Guardian Network had grown to include families from around the world, connected through encrypted channels that Dr. Marshall had helped establish. They shared stories, advice, and support, creating a global community of people who understood that the world was far more magical than most believed. Some of the children had grown up and had children of their own, and remarkably, these children often showed signs of inheriting the connection, though usually in subtler ways. It seemed the phenomenon was evolving, adapting, preparing for something none of them fully understood yet. When Connor turned 16, he made a decision that surprised everyone. He wanted to become a pediatric nurse to work in the same hospital where he'd met the cub. He wanted to be there for other children facing impossible battles, to offer them the same hope that had been offered to him. The token, which had grown with him all these years, seemed to approve of this choice, glowing warmly whenever he talked about his plans. He began volunteering at the hospital, and the staff quickly noticed that his presence had a calming effect on the young patients, though they couldn't explain why. During one of his volunteer shifts, Connor met Jacob Bennett, a young doctor who'd just started his residency. Jacob was different from the other medical staff, more open to possibilities beyond traditional medicine. When he saw Connor comfort a child who'd been inconsolable for hours, saw the subtle glow of the token through Connor's volunteer shirt, he didn't dismiss it or rationalize it away. Instead, he approached Connor privately and said simply, "I've heard the stories. I believe them. How can I help?" This was the beginning of a new phase in the Guardian Network's evolution, bringing in medical professionals who could bridge the gap between the mystical and the medical. Jacob brought a scientific rigor to the study of the phenomenon that complemented Dr. Marshall's more intuitive approach. He began documenting the physiological changes in children when Connor or the other token bearers were present. He found measurable differences in cortisol levels, heart rate variability, and even cellular regeneration rates. While he couldn't explain the mechanism, he could prove the effect, and this proof began to slowly change minds in the medical community. Not everyone believed, but enough did that the Guardian Network could begin operating more openly, though still carefully. One winter evening, as Connor was finishing his shift at the hospital, he felt the token grow suddenly cold, something that had never happened before. He followed the sensation to the pediatric ICU, where he found a little girl named Emma, barely 3 years old, fighting for her life after a severe allergic reaction. The medical team was doing everything right, but Connor could sense something they couldn't. Emma was leaving, her spirit already half detached from her body. Without thinking, he placed his hand over the token and then on Emma's chest, and for the first time, he consciously pushed energy through the connection. What happened next was witnessed by 6 medical professionals and would become one of the most documented events in the Guardian Network's history. The token's glow expanded beyond Connor, encompassing Emma in a sphere of soft golden light. The monitors showing her vital signs went wild for a moment, then stabilized at perfect levels. Emma's eyes opened, focused and clear, and she looked directly at Connor and said, "The bear says thank you." She recovered completely within hours, defying every medical prediction. When her parents asked what had happened, the medical team could only say it was a miracle, though, privately, each of them knew they'd witnessed something that would change their understanding of healing forever. This event marked Connor's transition from passive bearer of the gift to active healer. He began to understand that the token wasn't just a protective charm, but a tool, a conduit for energies that existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual worlds. He worked with Jacob and Dr. Marshall to develop protocols for using this ability safely, understanding that pushing too hard could drain him dangerously. They discovered that the other token bearers had similar capabilities, each aligned with their original animal encounter. Savannah could calm the most agitated patients, bringing them peace like the deep ocean. Logan could raise body temperature in hypothermic patients, warming them from the inside out. Haley could guide confused elderly patients back to clarity, helping them find their way through the fog of dementia. As Connor's abilities became known within the Guardian network, families began bringing their children to the hospital specifically hoping to encounter him. The hospital administration, while not officially acknowledging what was happening, began scheduling Connor's volunteer shifts to coincide with the most critical cases. It was an open secret that his presence improved outcomes, though the mechanism remained officially unexplained. Insurance companies noticed the statistical anomalies in the hospital's recovery rates, but could find no fraud or manipulation, just inexplicably good results. The token itself had become something of a legend within certain circles. There were whispered stories of other tokens appearing around the world, always in moments of crisis, always associated with animal encounters that shouldn't have been possible. A girl in Japan found a crane feather that helped her survive the tsunami. A boy in Brazil was saved from a favela fire by a jaguar that left him with a jade claw. Each token was unique, but they all shared certain characteristics. They were warm to the touch, they glowed in response to need, and they seemed to be made of materials that shouldn't exist or couldn't be identified. Connor graduated high school with honors and was accepted into the nursing program at the local university. On his first day of classes, he met 3 other students who immediately caught his attention. They each wore something that made his token respond: a small wooden carving, a stone pendant, a woven bracelet. Without speaking, they recognized each other as part of the same mystery. Over coffee after class, they shared their stories. Each had been saved or guided by an animal encounter. Each bore a token, and each had been drawn to healing professions. It seemed the phenomenon was not random, but was actively recruiting, building a network of healers for purposes still not fully understood. Dr. Marshall, now in his 80s, had compiled his research into a comprehensive document he called the Guardian Chronicles. It contained every story, every piece of evidence, every theory about the phenomenon. He'd made arrangements for it to be preserved and shared when the time was right, when the world was ready to accept that the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were far more permeable than most believed. He often said that Connor's generation would be the one to bring this knowledge into the open, to help humanity remember its connection to the living world before it was too late. The summer before Connor started his clinical rotations, something unprecedented happened. All the token bearers around the world reported the same dream on the same night. They were in a vast forest, similar to the one Connor had dreamed of years before, but this time it was filled not just with animals but with thousands of children and adults, all bearing tokens. In the center of the gathering was an ancient tree, its trunk so massive it seemed to hold up the sky itself. The tree spoke, not in words but in feelings, conveying a message of urgency. The balance was shifting. It communicated, and the Guardians would soon be needed for something greater than individual healings. When they woke, each token bearer found their token had changed. New symbols had appeared, forming a map or diagram when all the tokens were brought together. Dr. Marshall worked with mathematicians and cryptographers to decode the symbols, and what they found was both thrilling and terrifying. The symbols indicated locations around the world where the veil between dimensions was not just thin, but actually breaking down. These ruptures were allowing more than just helpful animals through. Darker things were beginning to slip into the world. Things that fed on fear and suffering. This revelation changed the mission of the Guardian Network. They were no longer just healers, but protectors, standing guard at the intersection of worlds. Connor and the others began training in ways to use their tokens not just to heal, but to seal these ruptures, to maintain the balance that kept both worlds safe. It was dangerous work, requiring them to confront entities that existed in the spaces between reality, things that could drive a person mad if faced without protection. But the tokens provided that protection, creating shields of light that kept the darkness at bay. Connor's first encounter with one of these dark entities came during a night shift at the hospital. He felt the token grow ice cold and followed the sensation to the basement, where he found a shadow that shouldn't exist, a darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than simply block it. It was feeding on the fear and pain that naturally accumulated in hospitals, growing stronger with each moment. Connor understood instinctively that if it wasn't stopped, it would eventually become strong enough to affect the patients directly, turning their fears into reality. He gripped the token and pushed light through it. Not the gentle healing light he usually channeled, but something fiercer, more protective. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted only minutes, but felt like hours. The shadow fought back, sending waves of despair and terror that would have overwhelmed Connor if not for the token's protection. He could feel the other token bearers through the network, sending their strength to support him. Finally, with a sound like tearing fabric, the shadow dissipated, and the rupture it had come through sealed itself. Connor collapsed, exhausted but victorious, and when he was found by the night staff, they assumed he'd simply overworked himself. Only Jacob, who'd felt the disturbance through his own growing sensitivity, knew what had really happened. These encounters became more frequent as Connor progressed through his nursing program. The Guardian Network developed protocols for dealing with them, creating teams that could respond quickly to ruptures anywhere in the world. They worked in secret, knowing that the general public wasn't ready to know about the dangers that lurked at the edges of reality. But they also knew that this secrecy couldn't last forever. The ruptures were becoming more common, the entities bolder. Eventually, the world would have to acknowledge what was happening and choose whether to face it with fear or faith. Connor met his future wife, Jessica Brooks, during one of these interventions. She was a nurse at a children's hospital in Chicago, where a particularly nasty entity had taken root, feeding on the nightmares of sick children. Connor had arrived with a team of token bearers, and Jessica had walked in on them in the middle of the cleansing. Instead of running or calling security, she'd simply asked how she could help. It turned out she'd been sensitive to these energies her whole life, seeing things others couldn't, and she'd become a pediatric nurse specifically to protect children from the shadows she knew were real. Together, Connor and Jessica became one of the most effective teams in the Guardian Network. Jessica's natural sensitivity combined with Connor's token-enhanced abilities allowed them to detect and seal ruptures that others might miss. They married in a small ceremony attended by the Guardian Network, the tokens of all the bearers glowing in blessing as they exchanged vows. Their wedding rings were made from fragments of Connor's original token, which had grown large enough over the years to share without diminishing its power. These rings connected Jessica directly to the network, making her a full guardian despite not having an original encounter of her own. Their first child was born on a winter night when the aurora borealis appeared farther south than it had in recorded history. The baby girl, whom they named Luna, was born with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages and a birthmark on her chest in the exact shape of Connor's token. She never cried, not once, instead making soft humming sounds that reminded everyone who heard them of the purring Connor had heard from the bear cub so many years ago. The tokens of every bearer in the hospital glowed in recognition, acknowledging that a new kind of guardian had been born, one who didn't need an animal encounter because she was already connected to both worlds. Luna's birth marked the beginning of what Dr. Marshall called the third generation. These were children born to token bearers, children who carried the connection in their very DNA. They didn't need tokens because they were themselves bridges between worlds. As more of these children were born around the world, it became clear that the phenomenon was evolving rapidly, preparing for something that even the most experienced guardians couldn't fully understand. The children seemed to share a collective consciousness, knowing things they couldn't possibly know, working together despite being continents apart. Connor, now a full-fledged pediatric nurse and recognized leader within the Guardian network, began to see patterns in the data they'd collected over the years. The ruptures weren't random. They were following ley lines toward specific convergence points. The entities coming through were getting stronger, but also more organized, as if they were scouting for something. And the tokens were responding, growing warmer, glowing more frequently, as if preparing for a confrontation that was still to come. He shared these observations with the network, and together they began to prepare for what they all sensed was an approaching crisis. The crisis came sooner than expected. On Luna's third birthday, every token in the world began glowing simultaneously, and every bearer received the same message. The door is opening. They understood immediately what this meant. Somewhere, a rupture was forming that was too large to be sealed by conventional means, a doorway between worlds that would allow not just individual entities but entire armies of darkness to cross over. The location was revealed through the connected tokens, the same hospital where Connor had met the bear cub, the place where it had all begun. Connor arrived at the hospital to find it already under subtle siege. Patients were having nightmares. Staff were making uncharacteristic mistakes, and the building itself seemed to groan under an invisible weight. The rupture was in the basement, in a section of the hospital that had been closed for renovation. When Connor and his team descended, they found a tear in reality itself, a swirling vortex of darkness that hurt to look at directly. Through it, they could see shapes moving, preparing to cross over, and at the center of it all was something that made even the bravest guardian step back. A shadow in the shape of a bear, the dark mirror of the cub that had saved Connor all those years ago. The battle that followed would become legend within the Guardian network. Every token bearer who could travel converged on the hospital, forming a circle of light around the rupture. The third-generation children, including Luna, were kept at a safe distance but contributed their unique abilities, their innocent faith acting as an amplifier for their parents' power. Connor stood at the focal point, his token blazing with light that had been building for 25 years. He understood now that everything had been leading to this moment, that the bear cub's visit hadn't just been to save him, but to prepare him for this exact confrontation. As the shadow bear emerged from the rupture, Connor felt a presence beside him, not visible to others but clear to him. The bear cub, now grown, standing as his guardian as he had once been Connor's. Together, they faced the shadow, light against darkness, hope against despair. The battle raged not just in the physical realm, but across dimensions, each side drawing on powers that predated human understanding. Connor could feel every token bearer lending their strength, could feel the children's pure faith, could feel the love of his wife and daughter anchoring him to the light. The turning point came when Connor realized that the Shadow Bear wasn't evil, just lost, corrupted by its passage through the dark spaces between worlds. Instead of fighting it, he reached out with compassion, offering the same connection that the original cub had offered him. The token grew so hot it burned through his shirt, but he held on, pushing not just light, but love through the connection. The Shadow Bear paused, confused by this unexpected response, and in that moment of hesitation Connor saw its true nature. It was another guardian, one that had been trapped in the dark spaces, twisted by isolation and fear. With this understanding came the solution. Instead of sealing the rupture by force, Connor and the other guardians began to heal it, to transform it from a wound between worlds into a proper doorway, one that could be controlled and monitored. The Shadow Bear, touched by the light of so many tokens, began to change, the darkness falling away like old skin to reveal a creature of light beneath. It had been a test, Connor realized, a final examination to see if humanity was ready for the next phase of connection between worlds. As the rupture stabilized into a doorway, beings began to emerge, but not the dark entities they'd feared. These were the true guardians, the sources of all the animal encounters that had saved children throughout history. They came in many forms, some recognizable as earthly animals, others completely alien, but all radiating the same protective energy that the token bearers had come to know. They weren't invading. They were arriving for a reunion that had been millennia in the making. The lead guardian, a being that shifted between forms but often appeared as a great bear made of starlight, communicated directly with Connor and the other senior token bearers. It explained that long ago, humanity and the guardian realm had been connected, working together to maintain the balance of life on Earth. But as humans developed technology and moved away from nature, the connection had weakened, finally breaking entirely during the Industrial Revolution. The tokens were seeds of reconnection, planted in moments of crisis when the veil was thin, growing slowly until humanity was ready to remember its place in the greater tapestry of existence. The appearance of the doorway and the guardians couldn't be hidden from the general public. Within hours, news of the phenomenon spread globally, causing panic, wonder, and everything in between. But the Guardian Network was ready. They'd been preparing for this moment, developing communication strategies, scientific explanations that bridged the mystical and rational, and most importantly, stories. Connor's story, which had begun with a scared baby and a lost bear cub in an elevator, became the cornerstone of understanding, helping people see that these beings weren't threats, but protectors, teachers, healers. The integration wasn't smooth or immediate. There were those who rejected the guardians, who saw them as demons or invaders. There were governments that tried to weaponize the connection, to use the guardians for military purposes. But the guardians were patient, and they had the children on their side. The third generation, kids like Luna, served as natural ambassadors, their innocent acceptance of the miraculous helping adults remember their own capacity for wonder. Slowly, over months and years, the world began to change. Hospitals became healing centers in the truest sense, combining medical technology with guardian energy work. Environmental restoration projects were guided by guardians who knew the deep needs of the earth. Mental health treatment was revolutionized by the understanding that many conditions were actually sensitivities to the energetic realms, treatable through connection rather than medication alone. The tokens evolved from individual tools to community resources, their bearers becoming teachers and healers recognized and supported by society. Connor, now in his 40s, stood in the same elevator where it had all begun, holding his daughter Luna's hand. She didn't need a token. She was herself a bridge between worlds, able to see and communicate with guardians as easily as with humans. They were visiting a new patient, a premature baby fighting for life just as Connor once had. As the elevator rose, Luna squeezed his hand and smiled. She could see what Connor could only sense. The elevator was full of guardians, invisible to most but always present, always watching, always ready to help when called upon with an open heart. The wooden token, now worn smooth by decades of wear, rested against Connor's chest, warm as always. It had grown with him from a simple carved piece of wood to something that pulsed with the accumulated love and faith of thousands of healings. Sometimes he wondered what would have happened if the bear cub hadn't appeared that night, if his mother hadn't been brave enough to accept the impossible. But then, he looked at the world around him, at the children playing with guardian spirits in the hospital garden, at the darkness that no longer threatened because light was everywhere, and he knew that some meetings were simply meant to be. As they entered the NICU, Connor saw the baby they'd come to visit, tiny and fragile in an incubator that looked just like the one he'd lived in decades ago. The parents stood nearby, exhausted and frightened, clinging to each other for support. Luna walked up to them without hesitation and said in her clear, musical voice, "Don't worry, the guardians are here. Your baby is going to be just fine." And, as if in response to her words, a soft glow began to emanate from the incubator, and everyone in the room felt it. The presence of something ancient and loving, something that had always been there, waiting for humanity to remember how to see. The story that had begun with a baby and a bear cub in an elevator had become the story of humanity's reconnection with the magical world that had always existed alongside the mundane. It was a story still being written, with new chapters added every day as more children discovered their connections, as more guardians crossed through the doorways, as more people learned that healing came not just from medicine, but from the recognition that we are all part of something infinitely larger and more wonderful than we'd ever imagined. And at the center of it all was a simple truth that Connor had learned that night so long ago. Sometimes, in our moments of greatest need, help comes from the most unexpected places, if only we're brave enough to accept it. The token against Connor's chest pulsed with warmth as he watched Luna place her small hands on the incubator, her own inner light joining with the guardian presence to surround the struggling infant. The parents gasped as their baby's monitors showed immediate improvement, vital signs stabilizing in real time. This was the world now, a world where miracles were becoming commonplace, where the impossible had become possible, where the connection between all living things was no longer theory, but daily experience. And it had all started with a scared mother, a sick baby, and a bear cub who'd somehow found its way into a hospital elevator, bringing with it a message of hope that would transform the world.